share the skeletal framework of how we'll be learning a topic of diarrhea and dysentery. And it is a very common problem which we will see in our casualty and in hospitals and even in our daily day-to-day life. And there are multiple causes behind it. It's just not food poisoning and infections. So it is very important to manage diarrhea and dysentery, and especially decide what type of severity of dehydration the person is suffering, because a severe dehydration can land the patient in trouble very quickly. So first, I like to mention the definition of diarrhea. So actually, clinically, we normally we say that 3 times a day or 3 times a week is a normal frequency of passing of stools for a person. So anything less or more will become diarrhea or constipation. But the standard book Harrison, according to it, the definition is change in consistency or frequency of stool with stool weight more than 200 grams per day. But it is practically not possible to measure stool weight. But then this is the definition Harrison mentioned, so I just mentioned it. But then clinically we can use the definition of more than 3 times per day with change in consistency or frequency of the stool. So yes, so there are multiple types of diarrhea. So basically we'll be only reading what is very relevant and important to us. So we can the types of diarrhea can be small bowel or colon, which I basically trying to differentiate between that. Is the cause is in the small intestine or is the cause is in large intestine? So as everyone knows that we have a small esophagus, then stomach, and then from stomach the small bowel, and then the large intestine. So if any symptoms or any disease occurs in stomach or esophagus, the first symptom will be obviously vomiting or maybe nausea associated with it. But if something occurs with small bowel or large intestine, then the first symptom is likely to be diarrhea. So that's why we differentiate diarrhea firstly on basis of small bowel and colonic, and we will discuss it more also because it is very important. And then second point comes to secretory versus osmotic diarrhea. So as the name suggests, it is very simple. Osmotic diarrhea, it is because I am eating some product which is retaining the water. So it can even be a diarrhea which is I'm inducing to myself. Suppose if I take Isofcola or husk that bind all the stool water, and we will call osmotic diarrhea. But on the other hand, secretory diarrhea is something very interesting. Secretory diarrhea is cell, first of all, whatever is outside in the lumen of intestine, whatever I've eaten, it is getting excreted, yes, and also the cells of intestine are secreting more fluids, more electrolytes into that fluid. That is also getting excreted. So secretory diarrhea is more dangerous. And then last is watery versus fatty diarrhea. So watery diarrhea is the water is getting excreted via stools, while in fatty diarrhea the person is also excreting fat into the stools. So it is also called as steatorrhea. And one more important thing, steatorrhea, yes. And one more important thing, if we want to inquire by history, the person had fatty diarrhea, watery diarrhea, we will ask them, did they look at their stools after passing stools? Did the stools float in the water?
Okay.
So fat will obviously float over the stool, over the water. So if the patient says that it was very slimy, the stool, and it was greasy and it floated over the water, then he's giving history that he had fatty diarrhea, and then we should get alerted that it might be a malabsorption syndrome. And obviously in fatty diarrhea the history will be chronic. So yes, as I mentioned, the small bowel and colonic diarrhea, the differences are very important. The reason is this point here, dehydration risk. If you can see the fourth point, dehydration risk. When we see someone having small bowel diarrhea, the dehydration risk is very high, while in colonic diarrhea, the risk is almost nil or no risk. So this point makes an important distinction, that why we need to distinguish any patient coming with small bowel or colonic diarrhea. the cause might be there are hundreds of causes for diarrhea, but my first priority is to differentiate if it's small bowel diarrhea or is it a colonic diarrhea. The cause in small bowel is it colon, and the reason is very simple, that dehydration risk is high in small bowel, while dehydration risk is almost equivalent to nil in colonic diarrhea. So what are the points which will make you differentiate is, so first of all, which I feel is the most reliable is quantity and frequency. So in small bowel diarrhea, the patient will usually give a history that he went more than 10 to 12 times per day. Book says the frequency can even reach 20 times per day. But before that only patient will reach the hospital. So usually the frequency is very high, and in colonic diarrhea it is comparatively very less, not exceeding 3 to 5 times per day. Then consistency is watery and semi-solid and mucoid in colonic. The reason is very simple. The small bowel is rich in watery fluid, while the contents reach the colon, most of the water has already been absorbed by small bowel. So that is why it is causing semi-solid and mucoid diarrhea. Again, the same reason that most of the food will already get absorbed in small bowel. So when it reaches colon, it will only cause small quantity diarrhea, but in small bowel, it will cause large diarrhea because the water is not also absorbed. And there's one more point. There's something called as rectosigmoid reservoir. So we all know that humans can voluntarily control their bowel movements. If someone feels urge to defecate, they can control their bowel movements for the social reasons for a while. They can store their stools. So when we talk about colonic diarrhea, that rectosigmoid reservoir capacity becomes really less. So the person cannot store their stools. So that's why they feel like passing urge to pass stools repeatedly. That's why the quantity is small. So there will be no storage. When I talk about small bowel diarrhea, they will excrete large amounts of stools, because first of all the reservoir quantity is intact, so they can store the stool at that point. And also the other point was that small bowel has not absorbed any contents because it is the reason of diarrhea. So there is content is large.
Correct.
Then yes, PR bleeding risk. Obviously, small bowel is more rich. Again, very important reason behind it, that all the small vessels will be absorbing all the food. So whenever there is per-rectal bleeding associated in small bowel, it is more, while in colonic it's less. And yes, very important that if the patient complains of pain in lower abdomen, that is either of the iliac fossa, then I should suspect it's a colonic diarrhea. But if the patient complains of periumbilical diarrhea, it is more likely to be a small bowel diarrhea. And then there's tenesmus. Tenesmus is incomplete urge. It's like incomplete evacuation of the bowel. So it is present in colonic diarrhea because colon has raw nerve endings present. So these raw nerve endings get exposed and they get stimulated. So the person feels that they have not cleared their bowels after that. While at small bowel, the moment they pass their stool, at that point they feel okay, they don't need to pass more, but they repeatedly get it again. But colonic, they won't feel that they have cleared their stools.
Okay.
So yes, this was important. Yes, no. This was the important difference between small bowel and colonic diarrhea, and this becomes more important than other classifications because of this point that dehydration risk is high in small bowel and dehydration risk is almost equivalent to nil in colonic, and this makes all the difference. Then yes, let's moving to causes of diarrhea. Yes, before going to causes, I just will tell you what will happen if a patient will go to dehydration. So we have this entity called as hypovolemic. So the patient goes in small bowel diarrhea or any matter which is causing dehydration, may it be trauma causing blood loss or anything else, the person will go in hypovolemic shock that can cause hypotension and can cause hypoperfusion of all the tissues in the body, and that can cause cardiovascular strain on that patient and in death in severe cases. That's why identifying a small bowel diarrhea becomes a priority and treating it.
Okay.
So then we'll move on to causes of diarrhea. So yes, the list is very exhaustive and huge. I've tried to incorporate the major and important causes. So I have tried to differentiate diarrhea between watery, fatty, and inflammatory. So watery diarrhea is basically, as the name suggests, it contains mainly water and does not contain fat, and the consistency is like water. So watery diarrhea is most commonly because of small bowel diarrhea only. So these causes are majorly because of small bowel. So first is osmotic diarrhea. So any laxatives, if a person is taking, even abusing any laxatives, the laxatives won't let the water get absorbed into the intestine, and they will retain the water. That is why he's getting diarrhea and osmotic diarrhea. Then secretory diarrhea is mainly actually due to bacterial endotoxins or anything like that. So what normally happens is when these endotoxins or something goes inside the small intestine, they causes some changes at biochemical level, and they may make the cells secrete their own water other than the water which is for small intestine. So this is very dangerous, secretory diarrhea. Then bacterial infections. Obviously, we all think that most of the diarrheas which we see commonly day to day are because of our food poisoning or eating out habits. That is forms a major part of bacterial infections. Major causes are salmonella, typhoid infections, and even Shigella, cholera, and even our Staphylococcus aureus can present as diarrhea. The interesting thing, Staphylococcus aureus, is normally the diarrhea which is associated with Staphylococcus aureus has incubation period of hardly 1 to 3 hours. So the person eats food, and within 3 hours, and it is usually a milk product. So the person eats food, and after 3 hours, he is complaining of diarrhea. So that history should be inquired well. That did he take what meals and at what time in last 24 hours? So that can give us a clue. Then next is diabetic neuropathy. As we had already discussed yesterday also in our diabetes session, that diabetes as a disease has microvascular complications. So those microvascular complications can cause even affect nerves. So those nerves can cause autonomic neuropathy. Those neuropathy can present as autonomic neuropathy, and the autonomic neuropathy stimulate diarrhea. So, and even can cause constipation of gastroparesis. And all. Then diverticulitis and hyperthyroidism. Yes. So very rarely, even hyperthyroid patients can present as water diarrhea. So someone is having constant diarrhea, and there is no cause to be found, then yes, we should check the patient's thyroid levels. And there are some cancers also, intestinal peptidoma and carcinoid syndromes. And then if IBS, that is a diagnosis of exclusion, irritable bowel syndrome, we follow Rome's criteria. So in irritable bowel syndrome, it is a diagnosis of exclusion. When we do find any cause, we attribute it to psychological causes. So, and then we treat the patient accordingly. And then last is medication. So even there are few medications which can cause diarrhea. Erythromycin and all my drugs can cause GI upset. So whenever we think about side effect of any drug, the first thing which comes to our mind is nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Any GI upset. So even metformin can cause sometimes diarrhea. So
correct.
Medications, any medication can cause diarrhea. So yes, let's move into fatty diarrhea. So the concept is simple, that pancreatic secretions helps in absorption of fat. So when there is pancreatic exocrine deficiency, there is fatty diarrhea. So these patients we usually supplement with enzymes. Then next is malabsorption syndrome. So celiac disease, Whipple's disease, all these diseases, basically the absorption of, there is a cellular defect and absorption of all these fats becomes hampered. So there is malabsorption syndrome, steatorrhea. So very important history the patient will give is greasy stools and foul smelling stools, and the stools float over the water. So this history needs to be inquired well. If a patient is coming with chronic diarrhea, not acute situation. Then inflammatory diarrhea are very dangerous. They'll cause massive again diarrhea, and normally associated with small bowel diarrhea, but can be associated with large bowel also. So carcinoma colon, Crohn's ulcerative, amoebiasis, viral diarrhea, radiation colitis. So yes, radiation poisoning either manifests as my infections because it causes neutropenia and all the blood parameters go down, or either presents as my diarrhea, because again the logic is very simple. Radiation affects those cells first, which divide rapidly. So there are three places in our body where the cells divide very rapidly. One is GI tract, one are blood cells, and then it comes to our hair cells and all our keratin or skin cells. So these three places are the first which gets affected. So many times it happens that a cervical carcinoma patient which has undergone brachytherapy suffer from diarrhea immediately because of radiation colitis. So there we can relate the cause and the diagnosis. Then pseudomembranous colitis is usually a iatrogenic diarrhea. So it is because of the reasons which doctors have given. So yes, for doctors, I would just mention that the two most common drugs which are associated with pseudomembranous colitis diarrhea are, first of all, cephalosporins. So which are used in and out, and especially even post-op we use Taxim in and out. So we need to know that Taxim and ceftriaxone can cause pseudomembranous colitis, and even clindamycin. So the treatment for pseudomembranous colitis is actually metronidazole, and it gets controlled very rapidly. Then viral diarrhea. So usually in pediatric population,
I'll take a pause here. When you talk cephalosporin causes, so sometimes we give Taxim as a first line therapy at the golden period before the surgery. So do you recommend that people should give Metrogyl along with it on the first day?
No. We should not give Metrogyl along with it. If they suffer, because we don't want to load patient on extra antibiotics. That will be not be good for patient.
In case if there is a symptom, then because the loading dose of surgery is only given once. So and in case if there is symptoms, then you will give Metrogyl. Done.
Yes. Either metformin or even vancomycin, but metformin is more safer, so it's preferred to give metformin. Then viral diarrhea, amoebiasis.
Madam, you said Metrogyl, bhaiya. Cephalosporin ka antidote Metrogyl.
Yes, not metformin. Sorry, metronidazole. Sorry, my mistake. Then viral diarrheas, or like even rotavirus diarrheas, adenovirus diarrheas. So normally occurs in pediatric population, very common. Then amoebiasis. Amoebiasis mainly commonly presents with dysentery more than diarrhea. We will discuss about entry in a bit. Then last is carcinoma colon. So usually carcinoma colon and Crohn's is ulcerative. Even melena and hematochezia are very common associated problems with it. So I'll just make a difference between melena and hematochezia. So hematochezia is diarrhea associated with fresh bleeding per rectum, and melena is dark tarry stools. So if basically it's a way to differentiate between upper GI bleed and lower GI bleed. So if someone had an upper GI bleed, the blood will react with acid and alkaline enzymes of our body, and when the time it comes with the stools, it becomes hematinized and will form black tarry stools. But if it's a lower GI bleed, there is a rapid transit and it will just cause fresh bleeding per rectum. So carcinoma colon is also associated with those symptoms. And then Crohn's and ulcerative. One more thing I'd like to mention, that any tuberculosis or any malignancy, if a patient gives their history of two things is very important: history of weight loss and history of loss of appetite. If the patient complains of these two things, the first DD which should always come to our mind is tuberculosis and malignancies.
Good.
The reason behind is that mostly all the malignant cells will release, there's something called as tumor necrosis factor alpha, which directly goes and suppresses the appetite. So this is the reason why when there is loss of appetite and loss of weight is again because of two reasons. All the doctors will first of all use glucose in a anaerobic fashion. So those anaerobic fashion will cause excess consumption of glucose, and that will cause weight loss, and especially weight loss associated with GI malignancy a lot.
Okay.
So for for instance, if I talk maybe cervical cancer, so incidence of weight loss with cervical cancer is not that much, but incidence of weight loss with carcinoma colon is very relevant. Even liver cancer, or maybe hepatoblastoma, or maybe pancreatic cancer, it is the weight loss will be very rapid.
Okay.
So moving on to assessment of patients. So when any patient or diarrhea comes to me, how will I assess this? So I already mentioned before also that I need to differentiate between small bowel and large bowel. So because I want to see that it is what is the risk of dehydration. So before as the patient present, we need to see how severe is their dehydration as of now, and then cause of diarrhea, duration of diarrhea. Because again, if the cause is inflammatory diarrhea, I need to be alert that. So I need to ask a history of any hematochezia or melena, or duration of diarrhea. Is it a chronic diarrhea? So if a patient says that the diarrhea has been there for past 6-7 months, then I need not worry at that point that it is not an emergency. I need not give an intervention immediately. I can investigate more and then can find out the correct cause and then give treatment. But if a patient says that he is only having diarrhea since morning and he is in severe dehydrated state, then I need to be very alert and immediately start the resuscitation. Then traveling history is very important. So many times it happens that there is something called as toxins or traveling diarrhea. So this travelers induced diarrhea is very common with foreigners coming to India or something. We don't suffer from this diarrhea because we are already endemic of these some bacteria in a society, or even, but those foreigners are not. The flora is new to them, and that's why they suffer from this diarrhea. So traveling history is very important, and it even applies for us if we travel to some other country and there we are getting diarrhea. So traveling history is very important. And family history, yes, family history, because if a same member of the family has also suffered diarrhea from morning, so I know it is something food related. So it narrows my list immediately to some bacterial or viral causes. I need so yes, it clears my suspicion and I can start immediately a patient on antibiotics. Then presence of blood in stools is a red marker, and it should alert me that either it can be tuberculosis, or maybe it can be just as mild as something like hemorrhoids, or it can be something very serious, also carcinoma or colon. So at that time, history of the age will matter, epidemiology will matter, family history of any carcinoma will matter, and again, severity of dehydration is most important. And the last is urine output. So urine output will tell me that if the patient is having this diarrhea since how long. So if the patient tells me that there is reduced urine output since 2-3 days, and he's telling, yeah, I had some diarrhea 2-3 days back, then I know that he's having the same diarrhea since 2-3 days and it is affecting his kidney and he is not in a good condition because already he is in hypovolemic shock. That is why the urinary output is less, so urine is trying to compensate all the fluid. So this is a very important slide, that how to actually dehydrate the patient has mild dehydration, moderate dehydration, severe dehydration.
Good.
So this is very important. So there are 2 points. First of all, from history, I can determine that if a patient is having severe dehydration or mild to moderate, based on it is small bowel or chronic diarrhea, or I can examine at that point. Obviously, examination is more reliable than history at that point. So in this point, the most important thing is my pulse and BP, because any patient will come to hospital. Obviously, I will first do vitals. Then only I further move on to my general physical examination or anything. So in the vitals, if my pulse and BP are normal, then it is mild dehydration and it's a good sign. And at this point, the everything will be normal. So skin turgor will be normal, eyes will be normal, mental status will be normal. So, but the moment pulse increases and BP decreases, it becomes moderate dehydration, and when the BP falls even more and pulse increases even more, it's called a severe dehydration. So yes, there's one more entity which just came to my mind. It's called a modified shock index. So what is modified shock index? It is basically pulse divided by systolic BP.
Okay.
So normally when we say hypertension, the cutoff is 90/60 for hypotension.
Okay.
So a BP systolic below 90 and diastolic below 60 is hypotension. But what happens is, if a patient has BP 100/70 maybe, and pulse of 110, so that person is definitely going towards some kind of shock. But then that person is the BP does not fall into the criteria to call it shock. So when I divide it, so the pulse is 110 and the BP is 100, the value will come more than 1. So I know at this point, if I start resuscitating the patient need not go in hypotension. So this entity is very important, modified shock index, and it is very simple that just take pulse divided by systolic blood pressure. Ratio is more than even 0.9, then I need to be alert that the patient is going towards shock and yet not in shock. So resuscitation at this point is very helpful. Even the research shows.
Rahul, I wish to tell you here, हम लोग जब अपना पीपीएच वगैरह में और अभी कभी भी सर्जरी में भी असेसमेंट करते हैं तो हम रफली बताते हैं. देखो बढ़िया बढ़िया मॉनिटर तो अवेलेबल हैं जब हम मेट्रो में काम करते हैं, बट जो पेरिफेरी में काम करते हैं वो विलेज लेवल पे काम करते हैं, तो एक चीज रूल ऑफ 100 है. अगर बीपी 100 से नीचे जा रहा है पेशेंट इज गेटिंग सीरियस, अगर पल्स 100 से ऊपर जा रही है पेशेंट इज गेटिंग सीरियस. सो 100 को मानकर चलेंगे. तो मुझे समझ आता है तुमने जो बताया.
Yes. So again, mental state, obviously Yes. So when the patient goes in goes in moderate dehydration, the mental status becomes lethargic. There is skin tenting. So basically, in kids, it's very reliable. Basically, when we pinch the skin, maybe over the sternum, the skin will take longer time back to its normal position. So it forms kind of a tent. So we call it skin tenting. And then when skin turgor will become very dry, the skin will become very dry in severe dehydration. Obviously, eyes will be sunken dehydration, very sunken in severe dehydration. And urine output, I already told, it will be decreased from beginning, but it becomes oliguric or anuric in severe dehydration. Correct. So yes, so differentiating is very important, and the most reliable is pulse and BP. So then if we once find that okay, pulse is elevated, BP is decreasing, I can see other points to just confirm my finding that is it a moderate dehydration or severe dehydration. But this pulse and BP are always the first thing to be done. It's very important. So yes, now what investigations I would like to do? The first investigation when a patient comes to me with dehydration. So I would like to do hemoglobin first to see that if there was associated blood loss or any occult blood loss. So yes, there's one more dictum that any elderly coming with anemia, we need to note any colonic cancer first. Okay. So any adult coming with hidden blood loss, elderly coming with hidden blood loss, then we should always rule out a possibility of, especially males, colonic cancer. So we should suspect them screening of colonoscopy. We might find sometimes in colonic cancer and TLC for any infections. So yes, I'd like to highlight from one point here that in Salmonella infection, there is not neutrophilia. Okay. So yes, if a patient, but it is not a hard and fast rule, but yes, if a patient is coming with diarrhea or maybe even constipation, Salmonella typhi can present as constipation also. So it is associated neutropenia and even bradycardia. So that indicates infection towards Salmonella infection. Okay. Then next is ABG. So since ABG, if it's a severe dehydration, we need to see that the patient has not gone in any metabolic acidosis or what is the state, because vomiting will cause metabolic alkalosis, but my vomiting will cause acidosis. Even my diarrhea will cause metabolic acidosis, and associated other things can cause, even kidney problem can cause metabolic acidosis. So I need to see what is the current state of patient's blood gas and pH levels to make sure I give the correct therapy. Very good. Very important. then blood cultures, stool
Just
examination, stool culture.
Just 1 minute. Now, Niyati, for your reminder, any patient of typhoid, the counts will not be raised. Count will be low. It will be neutropenia. आपको 3,000, 4,000, 4,500 ये मिलना बहुत कॉमन है. And this is what he's trying to point it out to you that उसी तरह से आपका साल्मोनेला के अंदर आपको देखना पड़ेगा न्यूट्रोपीनिया और ब्रेडिकार्डिया के लिए. ठीक है?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, even personally, I've seen one case where patient was had come actually for just came. He has had a history of diarrhea, and what we saw immediately that there was bradycardia. So the pulse was going to 40 and all. And actually, we called for a cardio opinion at that time because patient going in 40 and all might require some intervention. So ultimately, the cause was typhoid itself. So that bradycardia at that moment was managed with drugs, and then patient when recovered, then his heart rate returned to the baseline.
Good.
So yes, and so basically, when we talk about arterial blood gases in any patient, basically I would just like to highlight this point that it is the concept is very simple. So when someone's stomach, everyone's stomach has normally HCl in it, and someone is vomiting a lot, so that body's acid is going out. Someone is continuously vomiting, so since the acid is going out, the body's pH will shift to alkalosis. And when I talk about diarrhea is rich in lot of the alkaline fluid. So when someone is excreting a lot of alkaline fluid, the body will go towards acidic. So it might be even possible that patient had vomiting also, patient had diarrhea also, and the blood pH comes to normal. And those disorders, we call it mixed blood pH disorder, and they are not normal. Even though the pH is normal, at that point the patient is not normal.
ठीक है.
So yes, and then I would just do blood culture, stool examination, stool culture to find the targeted therapy or targeted organism, if any. But for that moment, I will start the treatment. So yes, very important. So yes, today I've added a special section in this, that how does ORS works and why it is a highlight by WHO. So
Correct.
Yes, management is fluid replacement. Obviously, the fluid replacement is important. Even if the patient's infection is not cured at that point, the patient, nothing will happen. But if I don't correct the dehydration, yes, the patient might land into cardiorespiratory arrest also if it goes to severe hypotension. So
Correct.
I need to correct the fluid the most. I need to focus on the fluid replacement the fastest. So first is fluid replacement, then there's antidiarrheal agent, antispasmodics, and antibiotics. I have mentioned antispasmodics and antidiarrheal agents for sake of completion, but they're not supposed to be used commonly. The reason is very simple. Our body is very intelligent. Universe is our body itself. So what actually happens is whenever there's infection in intestine, the diarrhea is a body's mechanism to excrete out that infection. And if a infection and we give patient antidiarrheal agent, all that infection gets retained inside the body and patient can land in even intestinal perforation. So we should never give antidiarrheal agent unless we rule out any immunosuppression, infection, or blood in stools. So this point is very important. Sometimes there's a tablet available as Imodium or Rocco. It is loperamide. So people just take it at that moment to stop the diarrhea, but it can be very risky if it is an infective diarrhea because all the infection is retained inside the body. Then next is antispasmodics. Even if we take antispasmodics, the muscle contraction or the intestinal contraction becomes less, and again the infection gets retained. So these 2 points I would like to highlight here, that antidiarrheal agents and antispasmodics agents are not to be given unless there is no immunosuppression, no infection, and no blood in stools. These things have been ruled out. Next is ORS. So I would like to explain ORS. So it's been WHO's highlight. There's a very specific reason behind it. So first of all, in earlier times, the ORS which used to come had a osmolarity 311 millimoles per liter. But now I've added in this figure, you can see it's 245 now, and we call it reduced osmolarity ORS. So the reason it was made reduced osmolarity ORS, so if you think logically that if person takes, so a normal plasma osmolarity is 280 to 300 milliosmoles per liter. So whenever we take something high concentration fluid,
कितना क्रिटिकल बताया आपने? ऑस्मोलैरिटी कितना बताया?
Normally in our plasma the levels normal is 300 milliosmoles per liter.
ठीक है.
The osmolarity of our in our body for everyone. So this osmolarity earlier the ORS which 11 which was more than this osmolarity. So what used to happen very rarely that since there was more osmolarity, it would attract even more water inside the intestinal lumen, which is not solving a purpose of diarrhea. So then they changed it to 245. Since 245 as compared to 300 milliosmoles in plasma will become hypotonic fluid, it will move inside our blood. So then how it works is, if you can see a diagram in lower left side,
yes,
on the screen, that intestinal lumen, and while my towards right side it will become our blood.
Correct.
So any cell has this channel SGLT1, SGLT1 or 2. So SGLT1 means sodium glucose link transporter 1. So it is a transporter which links sodium glucose through this channel, and then they both get absorbed in the blood. Whenever any patient is hypotensive, our goal of sodium in his blood, because sodium maintains the blood pressure. It is responsible for the whole osmolarity in our blood, and it is responsible for retaining fluids, and it is maintaining our BP. So whenever there is hypertension, it means that sodium has been lost from our blood. So at that point, the sodium and glucose, sodium absorption is very important. So what in this diagram is that sodium and glucose are getting absorbed from same channel. So now if you come to the reduced, the sodium is 75, chloride is 65, and glucose is also 75. The reason sodium and glucose have been kept same, and glucose absorption will promote sodium absorption as well. So this is the scientific reason that why they both have values equivalent to 75. If we can see this diagram, the sodium is also 75 milliosmoles per liter, and glucose is also 75 milliosmoles per liter.
Okay.
Then one more point I would like to add here is technique to prepare. So many times I have seen people buying ORS from the market, taking that ORS, adding 1 spoon into the water, and then taking it. So that will not help. The reason behind is that it will help, but efficiency will become less, because all the benefits have made according to per liter. So we need to make that solution in 1 liter of water so that my osmolarity becomes equivalent to these numbers, and osmolarity should become 245. So if osmolarity falls into 1 glass of water, maybe for taste or whatever, then osmolarity will become high, and then the purpose will fail. So technique to prepare ORS is very important. So we need to tell everyone of the patient that get 1 ORS packet, take 1 liter of water, and 24 hours. Do not keep it more than 24 hours. If it has already been more than 24 hours, throw out that ORS. It is not supposed to be drank after 24 hours. Then if there is a place that there is no ORS available, then we get very simple. That is 7 spoons and 1 tablespoon salt. That also will give the same effect in 1 liter of water.
एक लीटर में 1 टेबल स्पून, पर ग्राम्स में बता दो तो ज्यादा अच्छा रहेगा. 15 टेबल, 1 टीस्पून में 5 आता है.
So yes, whatever is there in that, it is I actually don't know exact grams, but then it is according to the PSM people, it is supposed to be 7 tablespoons of sugar and 1 tablespoon of salt.
Okay.
So in 1 liter of water. So that is also very beneficial. If there is no ORS available, then this is at home they can make.
7 tablespoons of sugar and 1 tablespoon of salt. ठीक है.
Yes. So then, but the best is to buy WHO ORS from market and to make it and drink it, because it has equivalent proportion whatever is required. So whenever a person will drink ORS, the sodium also will get absorbed and glucose will also get absorbed and BP will be maintained.
Okay. What
and
about
also
zinc?
there is that if gut is usable. Yes.
Zinc
Yes, zinc is also useful. That yes.
That's all.
Yes.
We are listening.
Yes, zinc also is very useful. That we will add on in the chronic therapy, and very important for pediatric population, adding zinc into the diet. Then yes, this ORS is only for mild to moderate dehydration, because in severe dehydration, person won't be in a state to drink. It will be so comatose. So we will first start IV fluids, then we switch on to ORS. So this is very important to start ORS as possible. So anyone getting diarrhea at home also, they can start ORS, because that will maintain their BP. It's very important. So this is the first aid in case of diarrhea, that to start ORS in any patient. It will also reduce its diarrhea, because it will cause water absorption and sodium, so it will increase the hydration of the person. So next, coming to IV fluids. Okay, so this is very important. So there are 2 types of IV fluids which are commonly fluid. First of all, there are crystalloids and colloids. So colloids are normally not used in practice because they're expensive and they are not very efficacious in maintaining the BP, but crystalloids are amazing. So for every patient, even post-op patients, even in anesthetic practice, we use crystalloids only. So they're ringer lactate and normal saline. So there's one point I would like to highlight is there is no clear dictum that where ringer lactate is supposed to be used and where normal saline is supposed to be used. But the most accurate I found was that ringer lactate is a very beneficial fluid in case of any acidosis. The reason behind that, the lactate which is present in that ringer lactate will goes to liver and forms bicarbonate ultimately.
Okay.
So when I ask anyone to do ABG in case of severe dehydration and a person has come with acidosis in that ABG, then choosing ringer lactate will be an ideal choice.
Okay.
And ringer lactate is very similar to plasma. So it is the electrolyte concentration is very similar to plasma. But if a patient supposes an alkalosis, maybe whatever, then normal saline will become ideal at that point.
Okay.
So we need to see that what is more safer and beneficial to the patient. So that's why we will start doing investigation concurrently as the patient comes, even to decide the later therapy.
Absolutely.
This should not happen that at the point we need to start IV fluids, we are thinking that now I will send ABG. So if we sustain anything, severe dehydration, or even we are confused about the clinical features, then it's better to send investigation and give a correct therapy. Then for severe dehydration, since in severe dehydration, patient would have lost massive amounts of fluids, maybe even equivalent to 3 to 4 liters of fluid over his whole diarrhea, and he would not be taking anything orally. So I would like to start the process of 20 ml per kg for first 2 hours, then 10 ml per kg for next 2 hours. And then if the patient is alert and he becomes, he can take orally, then I will start ORS, because whatever we give orally, that is best. If gut is usable, then use it. It is very important. So then for maintenance therapy, we follow holiday cigars rule. Yes, for any patient we can use this. Yeah, this is very important. So holiday cigar rule actually can be even applied to our calorie intake also for kids. So how it works is that for every so first I would not going to calorie intake. We will first start for fluids. So for first 10 kgs of body weight, I have to add 4 ml per kg per hour. For next 10 to 20 kg, I add 2 ml, and more than 20 kg for 1 ml. So suppose I get a patient of 60 kg and I need to see how much fluid I should give him for maintenance if he is not taking fluid. I need to replace his IV fluids in the body if he is not taking orally. So I only need to supplement everything. So for 60 kg, the first 10 kg I will add 40. So 4 multiplied by 10 is 40. Then next 10 kg is 2, so 20, and then remaining 40 kg is 40. So total will become 100 ml per hour. This is the same method even anesthetists use to decide maintenance therapy for fluids for the patient. So this is very reliable. And yes, also we need to see that if patient does not have a heart disease, then patients with heart disease and kidney disease, the fluid requirement is supposed to be given less, otherwise they go in failure. So before starting this fluid as a blind therapy for everyone, we need to always ask the patient if they have a disease of history of heart disease or they are any taking medications for kidney or heart disease. But yes, for a normal patient, which normally we usually see the patient coming with diarrhea, more common in population, we can follow this method, even for pediatrics. So then next is, anti-motility drugs. So I already discussed this. They are first of all very contraindicated in young. Okay, there's a mistake here. It's young and elderly. They're contraindicated in young and elderly, and the reason behind is that we can never rule out infections in these cases, and immediately, and we need to rule out infections or any malignancy or any anything like that before giving anti-motility drugs, because then giving anti-motility drugs will retain all the infection inside the body and that can cause sepsis. Then these tablets are very useful in secretory diarrheas or something which is osmotic diarrhea maybe, or maybe in case of irritable bowel syndrome. So loperamide is available as Imodium 2 mg tablet, or is available as Roco tablet, again 2 mg, and the dose is supposed to be given as 4 mg for immediately stopping the diarrhea, then 2 mg with every diarrhea. But it is only for osmotic and secretory diarrheas, not for infective diarrheas. And then another drug, it's a
आपने लिखा contraindicated loperamide in young adults? नहीं.
Not young, it's young and elderly. It's young and elderly.
Loperamide not to be given.
Yes, loperamide not to be given. The reason behind it, or if we have found a cause, that is, if the patient has osmotic diarrhea or if someone has irritable bowel syndrome, then it is fine. But any infective diarrhea or even any malignancies, it is not to be given to diarrhea, because at that time the body is trying to get rid of infection in a way of passing stools. So in young population, the infections are very common. In elderly population, the malignancies are very common. So it is mistakenly written in adults, it is elderly. So it is not to be given in young and elderly, and in adults also after ruling out infection.
Okay.
So then diphenolate again is a opioid. It is given. So the atropine is added with diphenolate so that people don't abuse the drug, and atropine will cause some unpleasant side effects if they take it excessively. So atropine is just added to cause some unpleasant side effects if they take it excessively. So then last is anti-secretory drugs. These are the latest drugs which are in. So there are some enzymes. There are some toxins which causes some cyclic MP changes and all that causes hypersecretion of water and electrolytes into the intestinal lumen. So whatever was present in the lumen, that was getting excreted, and that water and electrolytes from all the cells are also getting secreted. To stop that secretion, we can give Resica-Dotrer. Resica-Dotrer is again only given in watery diarrhea. It is not given in any case of any infective mucoid diarrheas or any blood in the diarrheas. Only supposed to be given acute and watery diarrhea. But the best is ORS. The ORS will correct the problem fastest. It will even stop the secretion. It will even increase the BP. It will give a person feeling of well-being, and so giving ORS is the first therapy or fluids, and it will help the person the most. The dose for Resica-Dotrer is 100 mg 3 times a day, and again it is not given in kidney disease and pregnancy and breastfeeding. Pregnancy breastfeeding becomes important here. So then antibiotics normally, so any person which comes to our OPD and is complaining of diarrhea 4-5 times a day, then the usual suspects are maybe the person has got some food poisoning or some infection, or that person maybe is complaining of amoebiasis. So for those people, we have drugs available as the brand name is O2, ofloxacin and ornidazole tablets, BD for 5 days, or Norflox TZ is available. Then if the patient has cholera and we get all the investigations done and the patient has rice-white diarrhea, which is very specific to cholera, then we know it is for sure doxycycline. We know it's cholera. Then the treatment is very simple: triple dose of doxy, we call it. So no, usually the doxycycline, the dose is 100 mg, but in case of cholera, we give 300 mg, one dose, and that cures the patient. And if the patient has typhoid, then the drug of choice is ceftriaxone, 1 gram BD, 7 to 14 days. But then in case of mild typhoid, we can go with cefixime or maybe cefpodoxime. And for Campylobacter jejuni, the treatment. And yes, as I already discussed, there is something called as antibiotic-associated diarrhea or pseudomembranous diarrhea. Suppose someone was on antibiotics and he developed diarrhea, and it is not up to the stage where it has caused pseudomembranous diarrhea formation, then rifaximin is a mild drug which can be tried. So rifaximin 550 mg TID for non-invasive pathogens, because it stays only inside the gut and kills the overgrowth of bacteria there. And yes, one more very important point is probiotics and prebiotics. So yes, many prebiotics then, but prebiotics also should be given with the probiotics to help the probiotics. So what is the difference between probiotics and prebiotics? Probiotics are the live microorganisms. So there are many brands available, Vidalac or VSL3 is coming nowadays, or Sporolac DS, it is coming. So live microorganisms which are beneficial to the host. So these are already, they will provide gut immunity and they will prevent pathogenic immunity. They will prevent pathogenic bacteria to grow.
Good.
Then coming to prebiotics. So prebiotics are like food for probiotics. So they will, first of all, probiotics will be the live microorganisms, and we are adjuvanting them with prebiotics that will help those probiotics to grow also. So they're together, they're called giving synbiotics, and person should take lassi or dahi or fibers which will help those probiotics to grow, and the person will get healed faster. So then coming to dysentery, I've just added dysentery in a very brief topic. So yes, dysentery is basically acute inflammation of large intestine characterized by foul-smelling diarrhea with blood and mucus in the stools. There, as we're talking about dysentery, it will be stool mixed with blood and mucus, not only blood and not only mucus. So when I'm saying dysentery, there are only most commonly two causes of dysentery, that is bacillary dysentery and amoebic dysentery, and it's mainly because of fecal-oral transmission, and the humans are the only reservoir. And treatment for Shigella is ciprofloxacin, 100 mg BD for 3 days. For amoebiasis, it is metronidazole 500 mg TID for 10 days. Yeah, that's a different scenario, that if amoebiasis has spread to liver, and then the therapy goes on for very long, and we need to, and there will be, presentation will be very different. It won't be just amoebiasis. The patient can mind with even right upper quadrant pain, maybe even sputum also if the amoebic abscess ruptures in the lungs also. So yes, we'll not go there. If the patient comes with dysentery and we are sure after the stool culture and stool morphology that it is amoebiasis, then we go for metronidazole 500 mg TID for 10 days. And if it is bacterial, there's associated fever with it. See, Shigella is a very pathogenic organism. The infective dose is 10 bacteria. So if a person takes even 10 bacteria Shigella, they will get infected with Shigella. As we talk about amoebiasis, it is a large intestine infection. So here a role of differentiating between small bowel diarrhea and large bowel diarrhea will come. So if we are clinically sure that person has blood, then we just give him this therapy and with the response after 3 days. And for MBBSs, we'll give metronidazole, but the most important always remains ORS and fluids. This is the crux of the whole story, that why ORS is important. And ORS, the concentration which is given in the packet is supposed to be made in 1 liter water and not just made as 1 spoon into 1 glass of water. So the whole packet should be added in 1 liter water, and then that should be consumed to correct attain the correct concentration of osmolarity at that point. And then only it will work efficiently. So thank you, and any questions we will discuss now.
Yes. I think, any, madam, you want to say, Namita? Niyati?
Yes, ma'am.
Any questions to him? What I will do, we will do is that we read it up again, and we read it up again.